this talk is going to be recorded and it will be available later on YouTube. We have roughly 60 minutes for today's session, which means that after our speaker has finished her presentation, which will be about 40 minutes, there'll be plenty of time for questions. We are using the Zoom meeting format, so please use the chat or unmute your mic in the Q&A session and show your camera to ask a question. So now for the presentation, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who is Carmen Mandiron. She's an associate professor, researcher, and director of the MA in Audiovisual Translation at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. She has extensive experience as a translator, specializing in software and game localization. Her research interests include game localization, audiovisual translation, and accessibility to video games and media. She has presented papers in numerous conferences, published extensively in international journals, and participated in several national and international research projects. She's the co-author of Game Localization, Translating for the Global Digital Entertainment Industry, the first academic monograph on this topic. And her presentation today will deal with the main features, priorities, and challenges of the translation of video games, the different localization models, the localization process, and the assets to be localized. Next, current trends in the industry will be examined, such as transcreation, co-creation, and dual localization. And she will also talk about the new technologies that are affecting the field. So without further ado, let me hand over now to Carmen. The title of the presentation is Found in Translation, Main Challenges and Priorities of Game Localization. Welcome, Carmen. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura. And before I start, I would like to thank Dr. Laura Ramirez and Dr. Miguel Ángel Jiménez for having invited me to be here. It's a huge pleasure, and also all of you to be here today. So thank you so much for coming. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, yes. So, okay, so let's go. So this is a little bit the overview of the talk, although Dr. Ramirez already mentioned it, but basically I'm going to be talking about all this a little bit, the video game industry, game localization, models, process, assets, some of the main priorities and constraints, and also some of the tools that are currently being used, and trends and technological developments. So I'm sure this is not new, so you all know this, but video games have become, in less than 50 years, a worldwide phenomenon. Almost everybody has a game, at least in their mobile phone. Some people play online games, etc. They're actually part of global pop culture. And of course, partly this has been due to the rise of casual games that a lot of people, as I was saying, play while waiting for the bus or at the tube station, etc. And of course, also, we are seeing that more and more games are going beyond entertainment, because they also are being used for educational purposes, for training, and also therapeutic value, excuse me. They're also being used for rehab, etc. Game localization. Did I skip? No. Okay. So sorry. Game localization. It's actually the main purpose of game localization is to maximize the return on investment of developers, because to develop AAA, which is one of the big budget games, like, for example, Assassin's Creed or The Last of Us, etc., they spent millions and millions of dollars. And of course, in order to maximize their investment, they need to sell as many copies as possible. And this means that localization is a necessary evil. Sometimes I joke about this, but I've heard developers say that localization is a necessary evil, or even that it's like going to the dentist. You really dread it, but once you do it, you feel much better. And this data is from 2012, but I think very much it still stands, that 50% of revenue of the game industry comes from international versions. Of course, this is not only localized versions, but it would also include, for example, British English, American English, European Spanish, Latin American Spanish, etc. But a big chunk of this revenues come from the localized versions. And I always use this, which is brilliant, from this website, nerfnow.com, which I think it encapsulates in a nutshell what, and with a bit of humor, what game localization is about. And as you can see, developers are often willing to go to, many changes, to do many changes in order to make their product readily acceptable and more enjoyable in the different cultures, taking into account the market preferences, what players like, whether there's censorship or not. For example, in Germany, as you can see in the second one, you might be wondering why, where did that clown come from? And that's because they have a government body that actually screens all the audiovisual, not only video games content, and censors it or requires changes. For example, there can be no dead bodies, or blood cannot be red, it has to be like greenish, etc., etc. So each country has their own preferences, their own gaming habits, etc., which need to be taken into account. So how could we define then game localization? So it's to produce a target market version that has the same functionality and provides a similar gameplay experience to the players. So basically what game developers and publishers want is that if I'm playing in Spain against or with somebody in China or individually, but they want all of us to have a similar experience and enjoy the game in a similar way, or as similar as possible. And it involves very complex technical, because, for example, if it's a game developed in Japanese, you're going to have to convert from double byte to single byte. If it's in Spanish, for example, you would need the special characters, the accents, the ñ, no, the N with the little hat. I'm sure you all know about that. The date format, currency, similarly to what happens in software localization. Of course, we have the linguistic and cultural transfer, as we do in any, I think, type of translation. There's also legal and marketing processes. Legal, because as I was saying, some countries might have censorship, or the content needs to be reviewed as well in order to get an age rating, which might be different. For example, it might be for all publics in Japan, even though it has some jokes with sexual innuendo, for example, but that might not be acceptable for such a young age group in Europe or in the States. So then you might need to, put a higher rating, etc. So these are the legal, and of course, marketing processes as well, because localization is in fact very tied to marketing, because, the main object is to sell the game. Most games are developed in English, but also Japanese is actually quite a strong language. And this also happens in other popular cultures. For example, manga, anime, we have Japanese as a strong language in those areas, even though often English is used as an intermediate language. So therefore, often what happens is that it's translated from Japanese into English, and then the English version is used to localize it into Spanish, Italian, Russian, etc. Other languages that are increasingly becoming popular as source languages are, for example, Chinese, Korean, because there are quite a few online games, for example, for Korean, or mobile games. And Germany as well has quite a healthy freemium, free-to-play, pay-to-win games, the ones that you don't pay, but then you need to pay for skins, accessories, better cards, etc. And there are a few big companies in Hamburg, etc., who localize online games from German into other languages. But what happens often, for example, in Spain, in France, is that developers either develop the game in English, or maybe they might do Spanish, but then Spanish into English, and then English into other languages is quite common. And of course, the number of target languages is also increasing. In the early days of the game localization industry, it used to be FIX, which is French, Italian, German, and Spanish, or fixed, which was English if it was a Japanese game. But now some companies like Sony are localizing their games into more than 20 languages. I'll show you now some data, for example, from Steam about the most popular languages. But what does this mean? It means that there's more and more demand for game localization. So it's an interesting field. And again, there's also not only more languages, but also more volume, more text to translate, because there are more and more different type of games, many apps that you can play on your phone, on your a tablet, many massively multiplayer online games. There's also esports. We're not going to go into that. Expansions, for online games or for other games, which include, new content, new events, new adventures, patches to games, downloadable content, etc. So more and more, there's a lot of content to translate, and also out of the text, we see out of the game content, which means advertising, marketing, publicity, guidelines, strategy guides, etc. And if you have a look at the languages more popular in Steam, which is the possibly the most popular platform for downloading and buying and games for PC. So English, of course, is the lingua franca of the game localization industry. But then you might be surprised or not, I don't know, that Chinese is the second most popular language, because actually China a few years ago overtook the United States as the country that spends more in video games. So then we have Russian, Spanish from Spain, German, Portuguese from Brazil, because it's only because of Brazil that companies have started to translate their games into Portuguese, because the Portuguese market was considered too small. Polish, Turkish, Korean. So it might surprise you. For example, we don't have Italian here, which used to be one of the most traditional languages into which games were translated into in the origins of the industry. These are data from a different source, a localization company, an important localization company. And they also say these are the most common target languages from English. And you see it's very similar to what we have in Steam, although here we also have Italian. But for example, Eastern European languages, Eastern languages like Japanese, Korean, Chinese are becoming very, very important. Also Brazilian Portuguese. And these are quite, I think, surprising as well, because usually we don't think about this when we think about video games, but these are the fastest growing languages. And as you can see, it's like Vietnamese, Thai, Malaysian, Hindi, Arabic, which is quite complex to localize into Arabic, because of course they write right to left. So technically it's quite different culturally, etc. So it's a big challenge. And I think that's why companies took their time, Tagalog, etc. So what this shows is that the game industry is booming, and it's expanding more and more. So there's going to be more and more translation work as well into all different languages. In terms of translation studies, if we think, okay, what type of text are we dealing with? So we're dealing with multimedia, of course, multimodal. We have different channels from which we're getting the information, the visual, the haptic, when it vibrates, etc. The audio channel. They're interactive, and this is very, very important, because this is what makes video games different, for example, to movies, in which, of course, there's a certain degree of interactivity, mainly cognitive, or also what it makes them different to, for example, business software, utilitarian software. Of course, Word or Excel, they're interactive, but to a very limited extent. But however, video games are really, really interactive, because the player is in charge of the story. You become the protagonist, and your actions, of course, within what the developers have stated. But the illusion we have is that, it's our actions that will make the game go away or another. Of course, they're non-linear as well. When you're translating a game, you rarely, well, never see the whole game in order, because of course, depending on the actions you take, you might do this, that, and the way the translation works, it's usually fragmented as well. Like some people might translate, some translators might work on the script, others might work on the menu or the text in the user interface, etc. So it's not, and some games, for example, a Final Fantasy game, you might spend from 50 to 80 hours playing it, and again, there's no linearity as would be, for example, in a movie script or in a book. So when you teach, when I teach general translation, you always tell students you have to read the text from start to end, understand. With a game, it's impossible. So therefore, this non-linearity might pose challenges. Especially because often translators work without access to the context of the game, which is something I'll go back to later. And of course, it's very, very important to always take into account that games are designed to entertain. Even games that have other purposes, like serious games, edutainment, games for health, they have other purposes as well. Maybe the main purpose in that case is to teach you something, but it has to teach you in an engaging and entertaining way. That's why they use a game to do it, as opposed to a book or some other methods. So the entertainment factor is very important, and it's something we need to take into account when we're localizing games, that we're not only localizing text, we're trying to localize an experience, a gameplay experience. So that's very important. And of course, it combines features of technical translation, because depending on the type of text of game, if you're translating a flight simulator, you're going to have to check very thoroughly how a cockpit for a plane is, or if you're translating a game about submarines, etc. So for localization, because of course we're going to have a lot of system messages from the platform to the user, very similar to the ones that you would get when you are using, for example, Word or another app, or do not disconnect this, saving, network error, etc. Of course, AVT, audiovisual translation, not in all games, of course, but more and more games include cinematic scenes, or scenes that contain dialogue and that are either dubbed or subtitled. And then we also have literary translation, because some games, an example for it would be Dante's Inferno, which is based on Dante's work, or Lord of the Rings, but of course, which combine, some literary elements with gaming elements. But even in games, for example, such as Kingdom of Hearts or The Legend of Zelda, you might have diaries of the characters, you might have the narrator telling you a story, you might have the description of the monsters or in the bestiary. There's games such as Child of Light by Ubisoft, which is a beautiful, like fairy tale-like game, which is all in rhyme. So if you were to translate that game or a game similar to that, you would have to rhyme the whole game. So again, you need to hone up your literary skills. So you might be working with many, many different text types. And of course, it's a type of constrained translation, like subtitling, for example, because we always have space limitations, not only in the subtitles, for example, but also in the menus, where sometimes they're populated by a lot of information, and you have, for example, 18 characters for a weapon name, or 6 characters for a character name, which means that you have to be creative, but with the space restrictions. Also, the fact that often we do not have access to the game means that we are translating a multimedia audiovisual text without having access to the visuals, which means that it might be difficult, because we might not know, especially if we're translating from Japanese, the body, or Chinese or Korean, the body language is very different. So these are all things that just make it more challenging and exciting as well, of course. In terms of levels of localization, this is from Chandler 2005, but basically you have no localization in some territories. If they think, I'm not going to sell very much, but I might sell a few copies in English, so they just release it in English. This also happens a lot, for example, in games you buy in the App Store. Sometimes they're just sold in English and that's it. Sometimes they just do the equivalent to the box and docs. Box and docs used to be, they only localize, you know, the box if it's a physical game, and maybe some instructions, because the manuals now, they're really, you know, no longer in paper, they're all online. And if it's a game for the App Store, for example, they might localize only the description so that it catches people's eye, but then the game is not localized. So that happens sometimes. Or then we have the partial localization, which means basically that the whole game is translated into the target language, but all the audio assets, for example, if there are songs, the dialogues, they are left usually in English and then subtitled. So basically they're not dubbed. And in the game industry, they don't call it dubbing, they call it voiceover. But voiceover in audiovisual industry is something different. No? It's when you have the two voices. But anyway, so I call it dubbing. And then we have full localization, which this is 100% everything, all assets, audio assets as well, they're in the target language. Of course, the preference for partial and full localization, it depends a lot on the money and the budget that the company has, because of course, dubbing a game is much more expensive than subtitling it. But also it will depend on the preferences. You know that there are dubbing countries, subtitling countries. For example, Spain is a dubbing country. So most gamers are always asking for fully dubbed versions of the games. But in other countries, for example, such as Portugal, which is next door to us, but they are a subtitling country. So therefore they prefer partial localization because they're used to watching movies in English with Portuguese subtitles. As regards the localization models, basically, we have the post-gold model. This means the gold version of a game is the one that has passed all the quality controls and it's now ready to go into production. It's good as gold because after I don't know how many years it's ready to go. And this post-gold in the early days of the localization industry, which was, you know, in the 1980s, early 90s, most Japanese companies and most games in general were translated like this. So basically you finished the game and then once the game was finished, you started localizing it. However, if you had not designed the game so that it could be, you know, with internationalization in mind, so kind of facilitating or enabling localization, sometimes it meant that the code had to be rewritten. This was okay for small games, but of course, as games, you know, got more complicated, developers started taking into account internationalization, but still, for example, the Final Fantasy, some of the Final Fantasy that I worked in, translating them into Spanish, we started once the game was finished, which was great because we had access to the context. However, now only indie developers really go for post-gold, and it's because they kind of wait to see, okay, my game is selling well in this territory, so I think I'm going to localize it because there's studies in Steam that show that if you localize the game into the target language, usually you sell more copies. But most big companies, even like Japanese companies who used to love the post-gold model, they're now going for the sim ship, which is simultaneous shipment. What does that mean? It means that I release the game all over the world around the same time. And this is great because A, I can capitalize on the hype that's gonna be, you know, created with the next Assassin's Creed or Uncharted or Final Fantasy. B, this helps prevent piracy and gray imports. For example, in Europe, buying the game from the States, because usually the games in the United States are released faster. So sometimes people would take their consoles to some dodgy looking place, you know, and they change the chip so that you can play games that, you know, are for NTSC as opposed to PAL. So basically to avoid all this, and also to just do one big marketing campaign, more and more commercial games are being localized like this. And this poses a big challenge for us as translators, because this means that the game is being localized as it's being developed. And I'll go back to that. But that's not as easy as just, you know, having a game that you can play and you can go back to check something, etc. And these are the most popular games. Sorry, not games, models. But then we have also crowdsourcing, which is also becoming increasingly popular, especially for indie developers who usually have very tight budgets and often cannot afford to localize their games. So what they do is that they do a call to the crowd, usually through Steam or through website or social media, etc., asking their fans to translate the games for free. And of course, this has its risks, because of course, people doing this, often they love the game and they know the game well, but they're not linguists or translators. Also, people drop. Sometimes it's difficult, you know, especially if it lasts a long time. Usually they need to hire somebody to manage the crowd, etc. So there are a few accounts of companies in Steam or in blogs who have gone for crowdsourcing, for example, for the first game, but then often they say, you know, for my next one, I'm going to do it, you know, paying translators, or I did it with professional translators, etc. However, crowdsourcing might be a good way to do it, for example, for languages that, like I'm a Catalan native speaker, so there's no games localized into Catalan because we all speak Spanish, so it makes no point, financial point, for the companies to translate them into Catalan. However, people would love to play Catalan, and there are, so if you have a crowdsourced version, you know, even if it's not perfect or it has mistakes, it's better than none. So sometimes it can work. And similarly, that's also sometimes what happens with fan translation. But the difference is that crowdsourcing, it's the company that makes this call to the crowd for them to work for them for free, basically. And fan translators is more a community of fans who really like a game, for example, a Japanese game or a Korean game that doesn't get localized into Spanish or into Catalan, and they decide to do the translation themselves. And of course, they gain no money, nothing. It's just the possibility to play the game. As regards the localization process, usually it can be divided in these three big stages. The pre-localization is mainly for the, if you work in-house, or the post-go model, because this usually involves playing the game a little bit and creating the style guide, glossaries, if there's no glossaries, for example, but not always, you know, you will not always be able to play the game if it's being developed. But they will send you the localization kit, which will contain, for example, a walkthrough explaining the different levels, maybe screenshots, maybe a demo you might be able to play, and all the information, glossaries, style guide, if available, etc. So sometimes you have this, sometimes you don't have this period of time to familiarize yourself with the game. If you don't, you know, if you don't have officially time, or you don't get paid to do it, I would still advise to look for information about this game, this company, this saga, because always the more information you have, the easier it will be. I have friends, for example, who work for indie developers, and sometimes they end up buying the game in English, you know, the mobile game in English themselves, you know, in order to play it and familiarize themselves, because the developer doesn't provide it for them. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It's a bit hit and miss. You never know. Of course, the more experienced the developer, the more information they will provide. They will provide screenshots, etc. And they will give you a chance to familiarize yourself with the game. Then we have the localization per se, which consists of translating, reviewing, which might be done by different translators, review each other's work, or maybe they might have an external team of translators in the company or outside the company. Like, it depends on different companies operate in different ways. And then some companies, especially Japanese companies, do that a lot. They have the figure of the editor. And the editor, for example, the Pokemon company, Sega, they have this role. And it is somebody who often doesn't speak Japanese. So, but what they do is they look at the English text, and then they make it sound more natural, more idiomatic. So not so much a translation as if it had been originally developed in English. And also the editor is very, very important kind of for different styles, because if you have different translators, it's very important to have an editor, somebody who does a final review to try and provide, coherence and consistency in the style, which of course that also using translation memories also help in doing that, but Japanese companies often don't use them. And then we have post-localization, which is mainly the quality assessment, the QA, and then of course translation of the manual, marketing materials, etc. And for the QA, there's the linguistic testing, which, for example, us as translators might do that, which is looking for grammar mistakes, truncations, etc. And then there's the functionality testing, which often is done by people who don't even speak the target language. And more, the trend in the game localization industry is for agile localization, which means that there's continuous batches delivery every day of a certain number of words or strings of text, very fragmented. It's also the tendency, before it used to be one translator, two translators. Now sometimes they have 8 translators working in a game because it's to try and get it done as fast as possible. Also, you are getting constant updates and retranslations, and that's also what happens when you're working as the game is being localized. Sometimes maybe, oh no, I spent like a long time translating this, and then they kind of get rid of it. So that happens quite a bit. Also fast turnaround, like maybe you need to, turn this batch that you got today, tomorrow, so it's very, very fast. And also some developers and some localization vendors, LSP, language service providers, they are offering this, I call it the 7-Eleven of localization. It's 24/7. So some companies have subsidiaries in North America or South America, for example, in Mexico, in Japan, in Europe, so that basically if there's an urgent batch or something that needs to be translated, somebody is going to be, able to do it. So some companies operate like that or offer their services like that as an added value. Now, the assets to translate. What do we translate? So basically, it's the in-game text, the art assets, audio and cinematic assets, the box and docs, and then paratext. So the in-game, also called on-screen text, it's made of, for example, the user interface, menus, help messages, tutorials, descriptive and narrative passages. For example, as I was saying, when you describe somebody, somewhere, a diary, etc. Text-only dialogues, and these are dialogues that do not have audio. And this is because even though games are more and more powerful and consoles have more and more capacity, for some games, it would be impossible to have all the text in audio. So sometimes you might have, for example, in a Final Fantasy, dialogues with characters that are text-based only. Or, for example, achievements, what you achieve while doing different missions, etc. We also have the textual graphics or art assets, and these are the artistic elements that contain text and need to be localized, but usually a graphic artist needs to redesign them, or the graphics need to be edited, etc. So basically, you cannot just put it in an Excel file, original translation or in a translation memory. No, it needs to be done manually, either redesign the graphic or somebody must edit it with editing tools. We also have the audio and cinematic assets. It will be songs, the script that's going to be dubbed or subtitled, manual, and then the paratext, which is the health and safety regulations, for example, the marketing, the messages that you get on your inbox, for example, talking about new events, new campaigns, the website, strategy guides, etc. And here we have some examples just to show you, for example, of the user interface. We have the help message, we have the commands that we're going to use. We have a tutorial, this screen here to include the name. This looks very much like software terms that you might find: delete, confirm, default, etc. This is another example. Again, every game is a new world, but as you can see, often the user interface is heavily populated. And of course, English is much shorter than Spanish or French or Italian or German. So often you need to be dealing with space constraints. Sometimes icons are used to save space, etc. Because this is a translation from Japanese. So maybe in Japanese they had characters which take little space, but when you localize it, you might need you need more. For example, when translating from English into Spanish, usually you need to allocate for 30% more space for the target text. And these are examples as well of in-game text. And as you can see here, we're getting more into more creative territory. For example, this would be weapons from The Witcher 3, in which some things you might be able to translate literally, others you might need to be more creative. Or here we have some abilities from Skyrim. Again, you would think you need to translate them so that they're catchy, that they often kind of refer to their qualities or their effects, etc. And then again, this is very different. So this would be a system message, for example, from the console to the user. And as you can see, this is very similar to text from you may find in software or software localization. You have variables, for example, this content here. Then you have tutorials as well. And it's important that they are translated properly, clearly, easy to understand, because if it's badly translated, players might not be able to play. And there's actually some examples in the literature about plot stoppers, some games that people could not finish or could not play because a mistake in the translation. Another type of tutorial, again, every game and every genre is a world. If you are translating a FIFA game, you're going to have to search for the terminology in your language. Achievements, for example, they're often very funny, or there's play on words. For example, here, this is from Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And there is one, sorry, it's very small, so you probably cannot see it, but there is one that it's the achievement title, it's called Eye on the Prize. And then the mission, what you have to do to get that achievement is defeat the Cyclops. So basically here, there's a play on words between Cyclops, Eye on the Prize, and there you have to think, would it work in my language? Would it? Wouldn't it? Another one is, for example, a maze from maze in victory, and it's playing with maze, and because it's defeat the Minotaur. So again, how are we going to translate that into Spanish, for example, because we have to keep the humor, etc. We also have, this is an example of dialogues without audio. And as we can see here, we have rhyme that, of course, if the original rhymes, we have to try and make our translation rhyme. We have the icons for the music, etc. And then yet again, another plot twist, we might have to deal with more literary passages like the ones that you have here that might rhyme or that might be much more literal than remember when we saw do not disconnect this, do not saving, etc. So we're dealing with a lot of different text types. More examples of descriptive passages when you describe, for example, the aeons or in Final Fantasy, the bestiary, etc. Art assets, as you can see, for example, in this map, what we would do, we would probably keep the proper names in English because usually they don't get translated, but we would change, for example, when it says, I don't know, forest, whatever. So we would say bosque in Spanish. And what would happen is that somebody would have to redesign or edit these graphics. Other art assets that sometimes are not so obvious, but for example, this action here or chain, these are all, or the HP, MP, the G, these are all textual graphics. So basically they would need somebody besides the translator that it's going to have to implement the translator's work. And here, for example, just to show you, let's see, is this gonna work? Yeah. Can you see my screen now? Is YouTube? Yes? Sorry,
yes, we can, Carmen. Yeah.
Yes, we can, yes.
Thank you. Just to show you, oops, you probably know this game because it's, you know, it's a hit. Also because it's the most accessible game ever. I will touch upon that towards the end. But you see, the graphics are amazing. For example, let's see when she plays the guitar, the singing, etc. Let's see if we can get her face and her to. No evil, because I'm blind. Anyway, to it all in my mind. Just to show you, anyway, it was very quickly because we don't have time and I talk a lot and I want to keep talking a lot. Sorry. So, but basically the graphics are becoming amazing. And now this video in YouTube doesn't have subtitles, but you know, you could activate the subtitles, intralingual subtitles in English, or for example, for the Spanish version, they probably kept the song in English, but maybe they translated it into subtitles, etc. And of course, games are becoming more and more interactive movies. And actually, this is the dream of game developers. And I think maybe virtual reality is actually taking us towards that as well, although it's very expensive and it hasn't really taken off because of the glasses and all that. But basically what game developers and publishers want is that games become like interactive movies where you really take control. And this is an example of the manual. In a manual, be it printed, be it online, it's kind of a mini compendium of all the different text types, because you're going to have an explanation of the trauma of the, you know, of the what happens now in the game, of the characters, of the game mechanics, of health and safety. So you also find a lot of different texts. And then marketing texts as well that you might get into your, if you're subscribed, for example, to the Xbox Online or whatever, well, or you have this game, and then you get information about the game, about updates, special events, etc., etc. I actually have friends who work in the game localization industry, but they only translate paratext, not actual games, because there's actually a lot of volume of this. So I've been talking about this more or less as I was going along, but just to summarize, what our priorities would be: to reproduce the gameplay experience of the original. And in order to do that, often the tendency is towards adaptation. You know, in Venuti's terms, is domestication a lot. Of course, if it's a game based on the Spanish Civil War, for example, we won't be adapting that, but we might still adapt, for example, some jokes or humor or cultural references if they're not very significant. But in games that are based in text, in fantasy worlds, definitely the tendency is to adaptation, as well to creativity. Often there's actually this buzzword in the industry that's transcreation, which is often applied to game localization, also copywriting, advertising, etc. But this is kind of when you, for example, if it's you cannot translate literally a play on words or the text, and you have to create it from scratch. Then idiomatic language, that's very important, because kind of gamers are multitasking, like you are playing, for example, in Grand Theft Auto, you're driving and you're listening to the radio and you're trying to fulfill a mission. So you're doing a lot of things at the same time. So the language cannot be a barrier. It has to facilitate and be easy to understand. And of course, if you are translating a Lord of the Rings, a Harry Potter book, you are going to have to keep consistency, because this is transmedia storytelling, and you're going to have to check, okay, so how was this teacher called in Harry Potter, and how am I going to, you know, Most often, you don't know whether the player is going to be male or female. So when the game or the platform addresses the player, for many, many years in languages such as Spanish, it's always been masculine, bienvenido, estás seguro, but more and more women play, and women sometimes feel alienated by this. So of course you need to try and find inclusive, non-gender neutral or non-marked language. Also, when translating sometimes dialogues, because you don't know sometimes the gender of the character that's speaking or the gender of the character that they're speaking to. So more and more this inclusive language, it's becoming more and more important, especially in languages, Romance languages such as Spanish, where we need to use masculine or feminine. In English, sometimes it's easier, but if you know if it's a he or a she, or if it's a non-binary character, well, then use they. Or in Spanish, for example, in some games, they use the E form, no, elle, for non-binary characters. Anyway, this is all very exciting, and a lot of things are happening with this. And just to show you an example of transcreation is the Animal Crossing series, which is, I think, it's brilliant, the translation into Spanish, because you know that in English, for example, in the latest one, when you are catching a fish or a turtle or whatever it is, they always do a joke, usually related to either the name of the animal or the gameplay. For example, if it's very difficult to catch or not, etc. And they're very well thought out jokes. For example, in this one is, I caught a snapping turtle. How can I snap without, how can it, snap without fingers? So here it's playing with snapping, snap. But of course, many of these are practically impossible to translate into Spanish. So what the Spanish localization team did, and it worked really well because it got great reviews, is that they rhymed it. So, he pescado una tortuga mordedora, cuidado con los dedos, que los devora. And you can see mordedora, devora. And this is just one example, but basically they had to do the same with all the different catches of fish or other animals that they caught. And this is transcreation, because they created from scratch, but still being restricted with either the shape of that animal or their morphology or their function, or for example, it's easy or hard to catch. So it's very well translated, really, and people love it. And also, I think the fact that it rhymes, it also makes it perhaps more accessible to a younger population of players. In terms of constraints, of course, we have that the translation is embedded in an electronic medium. So this means that, of course, we're going to have, again, space restrictions. We need to take into account all the technical elements, although usually we don't look after that. It's more the localization engineer. Space limitations and stable source text, which is going to change as you go along with the Agile localization. This lack of context. Imagine translating an audiovisual product without seeing it. And that's why this has been called blind translation or blindfolded translation, because you really are translating this kind of interactive and highly visual entertainment product without seeing it. So, which now you probably understand why sometimes there's so many mistakes, sometimes in games, because it's actually not the translator's fault. It's more the conditions, working conditions that sometimes they work with. And of course, we also have this enemy of translators, which are variables and tags. So variables are these placeholders, which developers use because they're very handy, because you can have one string and then just the variable, and the item will keep changing depending on the progress of the game. But for us, sometimes, or often rather, it's quite challenging, because when translating it, I might need to know whether I found, a blue, a blue sword, which would be una espada azul, or maybe it was, in masculine, un machete, another type of sword, and then I would need an adjective in masculine. So sometimes that also poses challenges, because you have to think, okay, what are the possible things that could go into this sentence, and try to write the sentence in a way that it will work, whether it's masculine or feminine, by using for example, constructions that are gender neutral, etc. And tags, sometimes tags, if you're working with dirty text, that means, for example, in an Excel file that has the tags, then you have to be careful not to delete them, etc. Luckily, most translation agencies, they all work with cut tools, and with cut tools, it's easy to hide the tags so that there's no problem with that. And also, more and more developers are becoming more aware of this, localization aware of, and the fact that some languages have agreements like gender agreement, grammatical agreements, and they're starting to use these tokens, grammar tokens or variables. For example, if male, handsome boy; if else, pretty girl. This is name will, depending on what you indicated, no, if you are playing like a boy, or if you are like a male or like female, it will provide you the appropriate translation. Or also, some developers are using these tags for number, which is also very, very useful. If solo, it's just one person, you; if not solo, you guys, etc. This is actually very, very useful for us, because it makes our lives much easier. Because if we don't know if it's one or more, we always need to be thinking of ways that can work for both. And sometimes they're not the most idiomatic ways, but they will work. So I tell my students always, in game localization, it's hard, but you have to sometimes realize that the best possible, that the best translation is not possible because of the restrictions. And sometimes you have to settle with second best or third best, that it's not the most idiomatic sounding, but that it's gonna work. So that sometimes it's hard, because we always want to be perfect. In terms of, yes.
We are running out of time. I don't want to put more pressure on you than you already have, but we have to start wrapping up. Sorry.
Okay. No problem. I think I'm more or less finishing. So just tools very quickly. We use word processing and spreadsheets. We use CAT tools. I'll show you now which ones. And not us, but localization managers, project managers use translation, content management systems, etc. And here you have some examples: Trados, MemoQ, MemSource, SmartCat. The client will say, usually will determine what tool you use. And here we have an example of not a very big project, 80,000 words, 1,000 files, but look, 12 translators, so fragmentation. So then they needed 6 editors, because of course you need to provide a consistent translation. So yeah, wrapping up. Latest trends, artificial intelligence for dubbing. So we don't need to worry that much about, okay, I don't know if this is a close-up or not. For example, in Cyberpunk 2077, they used artificial intelligence. So that was great. Sega is doing this. So basically they provide translation from Japanese that it's closer to Japanese language in the subtitles, and the audio is in Japanese. And then they provide a more adapted or more domesticated translation dubbed into English, where all the cultural references are translated. So you can choose which experience you want. Machine translation, it's also here to stay. Electronic Arts have started using it for content that it's not very creative and it's more repetitive, etc. Co-creation as well, which means that they include, for example, there's they include content for Chinese games. They do that a lot for releasing games in China, that basically they include Chinese content, and then the game sells more. And then accessibility, which
Carmen, we can't hear you. You just got unmuted. Like
Oh, sorry. Okay, so I think these are the latest trends and the things to look out for in the future. And thank you. Sorry if I went over time.
Thank you very much. That's amazing.
Hola, Miguel. Hello. How are you?
I'm great.
Good. In Los Angeles. Eh?
Laura is muted now. Laura is muted.
Yeah, there you go. So in the interest of time, I was saying that I will open the floor for questions in case anyone has any comments or questions.
And I practiced, but of course, once I start, I always go overboard. Sorry.
It happens.
I have several questions. I don't know if any of the students have questions, and I'd like to apologize for the horrendous traffic in LA. Christina is here too. Christina, one of our students, is here in LA. I wasn't prepared for this. I have a question. It is such a pleasure to have you here, Karma. I wanted to be here to introduce you to everybody at the beginning, and I really, truly apologize. I have two brief questions. Number one is the technical, and one the fun one. The technical is, you said you called dual localization, and I know that your friend Minako Hagen and co-researcher calls it like something like reverse localization. The fact that we assume that the target audience likes domesticated, like very close things, and then fans go like, I want to play the Japanese like authentic one, and then they kind of do like a localization of the Japanese into English, which is totally foreignized with all the foreign elements. So assuming that everything has to be like domesticated, some audiences might not. And I think she calls it reverse localization in maybe in your book too. I mean, you're a co-editor, and then you call it dual localization, which I think is great. And the next question be brief. What is your favorite part when you worked as a localizer video game? What was your favorite part? Because there's such a variety of textual assets and items that have to be translated. Like, what was your favorite one?
Yes. So yeah, the reverse localization and the dual localization, they're actually different. The reverse exactly is this one that they do a lot with Animal Crossing, and they did with the Final Fantasy, which is indeed that they from Japanese into English and super domesticated, and then the English into Japanese again, exactly, to give Japanese players a feel of the cultural transformation and the experience that the English speaking players got. And then this dual, it's something that Sega started doing very recently with the Yakuza series, and this is all for the English speaking market. So basically you can play both versions. You can play with Japanese audio and subtitles in English that keep, for example, the Japanese honorifics and some cultural terms, and it has a much more exoticizing flavor. Or in the same game, you can choose to play in English and much more dubbed into English, okay, so no Japanese, and much more heavily adapted. So the subtitles are different and the audio is different. And I think that's brilliant because you can choose, okay, and you can play them both and decide, because as you say, sometimes the industry tends to domestication, but people actually want to play Tokimeki Memorial because it's Japanese and they don't want to play, the, Americanized or Westernized version of it. So that's something quite new from the last few years. And I don't know if other companies are going to follow suit or not, but I think it's great. And I really loved everything, but I think the dialogues are really nice. And then I really liked as well, when there was a challenge, like I had to rhyme or a play on words, or, those things that you think about them and it doesn't come. So you just put something, and then when you're shopping or in the shower, then you see Eureka, and the solution comes. Your brain keeps going. But the dialogues are great fun. But also weapon names, ability names, things like that are also great fun.
I assume that the weapons that you put there, it was like crazy. It sounds like very fascinating, interesting to display. We have to say that in our program at Rutgers, one student did an Animal Crossing project in translation theory, and it was absolutely fascinating on the puns of words, like that yes. They did it. That you mentioned it, and I remember that one of our students in our program did it. And Kara, I think, has a question. Does Kara Warburton has a question?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I had to join a little bit late, so I missed the first part of your presentation. So I hope my question isn't part of that. My question is more technical. You mentioned in one of your last slides about the fact that the localizable strings are, embedded in electronic media, but then you also mentioned that you use word processing files and maybe Excel files. My question is more about the format of the localizable strings and how they've been internationalized, the text separated from the code, so to speak, and optimized for translation environment. Like we've localized games in where the strings were in JSON files or XML files or PO files. Sometimes they're in spreadsheets or plain text files, all of which I find a low-tech solution to this situation here, where we do need context, even if it's just a couple of steps before and a couple of steps after in the game. Some companies provide a storyboard, some of them provide screenshots. Sometimes you just have to play the game. And on one of your last slides, you showed a bunch of CAT tools, none of which, in my opinion, are really optimized for game localization. So my question is, have you found a really suitable environment, technical environment, so to speak, for the optimization of game localization?
No, the answer is no, and I think you described, the situation perfectly. You might work exactly with even WordPad, Notepad++, Sublime Text, PO Editor, Excel, and of course they love Excel. They should wear T-shirts. I love Excel because it's so easy to import and export exactly, from the engine. So that's why, no matter what, it's probably going to end up in an Excel file, but then I think the language service providers are kind of, and this is a huge improvement because in my day it was Excel, indie developers still Excel or Notepad or even Word. What they're doing is, as you said, importing them into the CAT tools. But again, these CAT tools, they haven't really been designed for game localization. So even though, MemoQ is quite popular, or MemSource now because it's in the cloud, no, now keywords have bought Xlog. I don't know if you know Xlog, which is it's called, it's called Xlog, and I think it was developed by Stephanie O'Malley Deming, and they sold it. Keyword just bought it, and I think this integrates everything. It's like a content management tool, and also it has like translation memories, etc. So, but I don't think it has taken off as much in compared to other CAT tools. So I think they're way behind. way behind. It has been very slow, this industry, or this sector of the localization industry. I think the fact that the creativity, and a lot of game developers view themselves as creators, as literary, almost authors, and that's why they're being a bit skeptical, especially Japanese companies, because they think, no, we cannot use, because this is art, it's like cinema or things like that. And I think that's been part of the problem. But I know Electronic Arts, for many years, they've been working on machine translation, and most companies, big LSP, are very interested in machine translation as well for games. So we'll see what happens with that. But you're right. I think more research is probably needed. But again, they're so cagey, and they provide so little information and everything. It's so hard that it's difficult to get better unless there's synergies and collaboration between industry and academia, I think. But you're right. A long way to go still, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you. I actually have a question now that you were talking about machine translation. I was curious. First, thank you for the presentation. I thought it was fascinating how you described the video game. I don't know if you call it like a genre or more like a landscape of genres, because at the end of the day, you find a little bit of everything, right? Like from persuasion to, literary texts, everything. And I've realized recently, I have a stepdaughter, and she plays a lot of Roblox and Minecraft, and so they're constantly chatting with each other, right? Because it's and sometimes she will only call me, and when she encounters someone in the game that speaks another language, like suddenly there's someone in the game from Brazil or from Spain, and she's like, Laura, translate. So I was wondering if, like, how are developers like dealing with this, like, you know, these interactive games where like multiple players, and then you might, you know, come across someone that doesn't speak the language. Are they using machine translation? Are they like providing any solution at all, or?
Yeah, like it depends on the developer and the game, but some of them, yeah, do provide like machine translation. Some of them also limit, you know, they make you play with servers only, you know, from some countries, etc., so that you might not encounter other people like that. But yeah, some of them do provide machine translation, little apps, or you know, that work like that. Yes. And again, or some try to prevent that, you know, if they don't do that, so that you won't be able to play. But of course, players often manage to do whatever they want. They overcome censorship, blood patches as well. For example, in Germany, I didn't talk about that, but the game is censored, and then the players release a patch so that you can get all everything that's been censored. But yeah, they do have some machine translation exactly for that. And electronic arts, for example, for the chat, you know, for the chat, the chat solution or functionality of the games, some of them do provide, but of course the translations are you know, you never know what you might get, but maybe that makes it more exciting. I don't know, but and at least it often it just gives you an idea. And again, a lot of the jargon that gamers use, even in Spain, a lot of it's from English. They use a lot of English or words derived from English, farmear, etc. So things like that, they might understand each other because they use also a lot of acronyms. Actually, that's a whole other world. All these the gamers speak. So a lot of them know it in English as well. So some things they might be able to communicate, or the text, machine translation for text chat, exactly. That's one of the things that they use it for, because they don't use it for creative content, but for other things like that, yes.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think you might even like add like an added layer, right? Like what you were saying, that maybe like the mistakes of the machine translation, or that might become part of the game too.
Exactly. And yeah, seeing, you know, I don't really know what we're saying, but it makes it more exciting.
Great, thank you so much. Are there any other questions? No.
Data overload.
Yeah, no, it's like in weddings, like que hablen ahora o callen para
siempre. O calle para siempre, exacto. Sí, sí,
okay.
Sí.
So thank you so much, Carmen. That was like fascinating. We learned so much. Thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you stay 1 second, Karma?
Me.
Can you stay 1 second, Karma?
Yes.
I have to say that we have a class, right? And we will go back in 10 minutes to the Zoom from the class. I can give the Zoom to anybody who wants to join our class on specialized translation if you would like. It's for all the students that are in the class, okay? And thanks a lot. And if you can stay, Karma, 1 minute, I will be great. Okay, guys, we'll see you in 10 minutes, and everybody else, I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you, gracias.
Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias.